Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well today. Today, we're going to talk about the chapter Intersections, which covers intersectionality. We have a lot to cover today, so these are the discussion questions. We're going to talk about social identity, privilege. We're going to talk about intersectionality, the definition, a little bit about the history. We are also going to cover issues of race, class, sexuality, gender, able-bodiedness, and a few other things, aging as well. So it's a really interesting chapter, and I hope you enjoy it. So the first thing we want to cover is kind of a basic definition. So what do we mean when we say something like social identities? What we're talking about here are culturally constructed and available categories. So these are categories that we either place ourselves in or we use these pre-constructed categories. They're like ideologies about gender, about our identity of gender, and we place other people into them and we place ourselves into them. They change over time, which is why they're culturally constructed. And they tend to be available for most of us to use, but in different ways. And we'll talk about how that occurs. And we also need to know a little bit about privilege. So I know today the term privilege is a little bit of a hot button topic, but privilege simply means any type of the way that Lisa Wade defines it, she says it's an unearned social or economic advantage related to some part of our social identity. So all of us have some privileges and some disadvantages. We tend to see and know our disadvantages where we're not privileged, but our privileges tend to be invisible to us. And that's why we tend to think we don't really have them. But even if you're not wealthy, even if you're not in part of the dominant racial group, you might have privilege based on your age, able-bodiedness, sexuality, gender identity, sexual identity. So there's all ways, a all bunch of different ways in which you might end up having one or more forms of privileges as well as one or more forms of disadvantages based on your social location and your social hierarchy in life. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of intersectionality. At this point in your academic career, I would assume you've probably heard this term before. You may have heard a few running definitions of it. And it comes from a long history of academic thought and Black feminist theory, specifically somebody who we refer to as the mother of Black feminism, Anna Julia Cooper, who was born in 1858. She wrote this book called A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South. And in this book, she essentially was the first one to really kind of argue this concept of intersectionality, even though the term was not coined yet. And she said that neither women's experiences nor Black people's experiences could be understood without the consideration of the unique lives of Black women. What did she mean? She meant that you can't isolate in context just Black people or just women, that you need to understand the intersection, even though she didn't use that term, of the life and identity of Black women together, that they have a specific um, social identities, culturally constructed identity, set of disadvantages and privileges. And so to understand um, the way that Black people in general perceive the world, or the way that women in general perceive the world, you also need to understand the social location and identity and how Black women experience the world. Today, we would push that further. You can't just take one intersection, right? So we say you need to understand from multiple intersections of what it means to be a woman um, who is Black or Hispanic or Asian or trans or aging or able-bodied or not able-bodied, right? So you need to understand these multiple intersections to understand how women experience the world with all of their privileges and disadvantages, all their access to resources and how they're blocked, right? So we need to understand all of those intersections. One of the things that the 1960s women's movement didn't do right was that they didn't have that intersectional lens. And it was very much a social movement that was started by and led by and and led by white women, and predominantly white middle class women who were still in the home. They were doing the breadwinner homemaker strategy that was popular in the 50s and the 60s. And they wanted to have more equal rights and they were advocating for the right to move into the workforce. What was missed was Hispanic women and Black women had been in the workforce for generations already. So this social movement missed the context, understanding, and experiences of women of color almost entirely. And later on, it was one of the critiques of that particular social movement. They also did tend to generalize white women's experiences to all women's experiences. And again, that was a miss in regards to understanding women's experiences. So the people that you probably know in terms of the concept, the theory of intersectionality are Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. So the first person who introduces the term intersectionality to us is Kimberly Crenshaw. She was a law professor. She introduced it in 1991. And the example stems from a General Motors lawsuit in 1972 where Black women had brought a case against General Motors, and they said that they were discriminated against, but they lost the case. General Motors won. And the argument was that General Motors employed Black men and General Motors employed white women. So therefore, Black women were not discriminated against, or they were not at fault for discrimination because they employed women and they employed Black men, right? And they won. They won the lawsuit. And in addition to that, well, Crenshaw argued that the law needs to take into account the intersections of identity of race and sex, so intersectionality of those two identities. And the law then and now does not take into account any intersection. So there's no law specifically forbidding discrimination against Black women in particular. And so you see this kind of movement forward. Crenshaw then starts to write several papers, and she further defines intersectionality, gives us multiple variations. She kind of brings forward, like talks about intersectionality, and gives additional examples and interpretations. And you see academics, especially sociologists, continue to add to this concept of intersectionality. One of them, most notably, was Patricia Hill Collins. So she wrote a book called Black Feminist Thought. And in that book, she argues that there's a coexistence of multiple intersections of inequality. In other words, it's not just about your race and your sex, that we have multiple intersections of inequality, and I would argue also privilege, right? That's one of the things that we add as that definitions. She would say, you as your identity, if you think about it, right, you may be part of the dominant group in regards to some parts of your identity, but part of the subordinate group in other parts of your identity. So are you male-bodied, female-bodied, intersexed? Are you heterosexual or part of the LGBTQ community? Are you young or are you aging? Are you able-bodied or do you have a disability? Are you are you part of the dominant racial group, white? Are you a person of color in some way, shape, or form, right? And so Patricia Hill Collins argues that we have all these multiple advantages and disadvantages, and they intersect and create like a unique identity for us as individuals. And we all have multiple intersections of those unique identities. You probably will see a picture every once in a while of a signpost, and it's got like all the crossroads, right? And it has to explain Collins's definition, and it has, you know, race and class and sex and all those things. So she brings us that deeper layer, and she's added to Crenshaw's definition of intersectionality. But intersectionality, kind of just to reiterate in a little simpler form, is the intersection or the, you know, the crossroads of our multiple identities that we all carry. Some of those identities carry advantages, and some of those identities carry disadvantages. Some of those identities allow us access to resources that help us get ahead in life, privileges, and some of them allow us, block us from access to resources to help us get through life. So here's kind of a nice, simple definition: the understanding that our sex and gender intersect with multiple other social locations, things like race, class, religion, sexual orientation, right? Age, I can keep going. We're all complicated individuals, right? We all have multiple layered identities. Nobody is, very rarely is somebody part of only dominant groups. And because of that, we have different gender strategies that are afforded to us based on our social locations in life, our social identities in life. And so we end up having to find ways of doing gender. Remember that term, doing gender, which is the way we perform gender, that incorporate not just our interests and our values, but our identity or the identities that are offered to us in society. Um, and that allows us or limits us from being able to perform gender in a way that we may actually want to do, right? So, a gender strategy is essentially the set of actions that you take to manage the opportunities and the constraints that you have that affirm a gender identity in a specific way. So what I mean by that is you perform gender, you choose from the available options to you based on your race and your class and your sexuality and your sex, right? And you tend to perform gender in a way that is from that menu of socially acceptable strategies. And that can offer you privileges, but it can also create situations where you may be perceived in a way that you don't necessarily want to be perceived or you don't necessarily like, or it may even prevent you from performing gender in a way that you would want to perform gender. I think that's probably less so today. That's one of the big pushbacks from young people today, is that they're pushing back against this idea that they should be limited in the way that they perform gender to what society says is socially acceptable. Even when you're doing that, though, that's still a gender strategy. So let's talk a little bit about the first thing that the first identity she talks about, and that's race. And she covers race and racism, right? And so Lisa Wade defines race as socially meaningful set of distinctions based on superficial and imagined biological difference, right? So what is race? Race is an identity that others place on us, not we choose for ourselves. That's your ethnicity, actually. So race is how others perceive you and identify you, and they do that based on um, usually external characteristics, and then they make assumptions about what racial category you fit into. Just as kind of a side note, try this in real life. Like, try to sit down somewhere public and like I specifically identify people's race, and you'll notice how confusing it and difficult it is because it's not as clear cut as we would first imagine. And one of the reasons why is because race is actually a social construction. So biologically, we're pretty much identical. We're about 99.9% of our physical and genetic traits overlap. Um, Most human variability, like the differences between us, like how you and I look different, actually more of that occurs within what we would call one racial group than between two different racial groups, if that makes sense. There's more variability among people you would consider to all be um, of an Asian descent or race, or of a black descent or race, right? Than there is between black people and Asian people. Most of the variation is, genetically speaking, is just amongst individuals, right? But for the most part, we are not genetically different. We're not technically another race. According to biologists, we're actually technically not a different race. If we had Neanderthals walking amongst us, we would have another race. They would technically be another race. Biologists actually, what we call race, biologists call populations. And even the Office of Management and Budget, OMB is what it's called. You probably know the OMB as the census. That's the data they collect, right? That data form they collect. But it's actually the OMB. Their definition of race in the way that they ask it has changed over time, and this is what they actually say about their own definition or their own classifications. These classifications should not be interpreted as being scientific or anthropological in nature, right? So they're specifically telling us this is not scientific, this is not anthropological. Biologists are saying race is a social construction. um, we actually know that the definitions from the OMB have changed over time. So, for example, prior to me being born, I was born in 1976. You could only choose one category, and if you were um, and Hispanic was a racial category. After 1976, you could choose multiple categories, and Hispanic was no longer um, a racial category, it's an ethnic category. So you're Hispanic culturally, your ethnicity is Hispanic, and you're white, or and you're black, and you're Asian, right? So it's your ethnicity. And an ethnicity is like your language, your social location, like where you're from, your culture. That's your ethnicity. So that's a better way of describing who we are most of the time. And ironically, biologists, when they define populations, even the ones they give us when we do like ancestry stuff, they define populations in the same way sociologists define ethnicity. And that is because it's a social construction. So, how do we know race is a social construction? It's often used as a great example of a social construction. And that's because race, although it's not biologically or technically real, it's extremely real in its consequences. The race that people give you, that they define you as, has very real worldly consequences, right? But your race can change over time and place. Like if you move to another country, how you're perceived, how your race is perceived can change. Um, like in, I want to say it's Brazil or whatever, instead of saying like black or white, they have different colors. So you could be cinnamon, you can be caramel, right? I want to be caramel. I don't know what that looks like, but I want to be caramel. Um, it just sounds like a lovely racial category, doesn't it? Right? So even myself, if I move to another country, my racial identity, the way that people perceive me, not the way I perceive myself, can change. In addition to that, it changes over time because, for example, the OMB has changed their categories over time. Just myself, as an example, I was born in 1976. So in 1976, I was defined as Hispanic, right? Because I'm Hispanic. So that was my racial category. So when I was born, I was labeled as Hispanic. But in I want to say 1997, they changed the categories, and that meant that um, my category became an ethnicity. So I'm Hispanic white. My racial category is white, and my ethnicity became Hispanic. And you could then choose multiple ones. So my race actually changed according to the OMB. So over time, racial categories change. Um, over from locations, culture to culture, over places, racial categories change. And we know that race is not real, but it can be real. It is very real in its consequences. Another good example of a social construction is money. Money is not inherently real, it's not tangibly real, but because we agree it's real, it becomes very real in its consequences. But you can go to another country and their money's different, but it's also very real in its consequences. But it's paper, just like ours, right? And we also know that over time, money has changed. There were times in history where shells were used, where gold was used, the way coins emerged and paper money emerged. All of that has changed over time. So it changes over time, place, and it doesn't have to be real in its consequences. You can kind of identify if something is real or not based on those three categories, right? So, is something a social construction? I know it's a social construction if I can place a change in time, in location, and it not necessarily having to be real, but can be real in its consequences. Um, Another good example is a river, or a river as a border. A river is real. A river as a border between two countries is a social construction. Okay, so I've given you a couple examples and I've explained it. You're not allowed to use my examples as the answers, by the way. Okay, so then Lisa Wade talks about intersections of race, right? And how race and our gender strategies, how they change, right? So we have different options available to us based on who we are. And so for African American men and women, what is for specifically African American men, culturally, we have imposed this idea that they are hypersexual, right? So African American men often um, might be pushed into or have this hypersexuality definition imposed over them and may choose to use that gender strategy because it's one of the largest ones offered to them as performing masculinity through being hypersexual. And to some extent, that's kind of imposed on Black women as well, although not to the same extent it is imposed on men. For Black women, one of the costs that they have is one of the restraints really is that they're not allowed by as like a culturally acceptable way of performing gender to be hyper girly, to be very girly, right? To do the girly girl strategy, bows in your hair and lots of pink and lots of cutesy colors and having a high pitched voice and doing the very very ultra feminine behavior. They may be gender policed by especially other Black women and men um, as selling out or performing whiteness. And so you don't often see a Black woman who performs ultra femininity or that girly girl gender strategy because they often have a lot of gender policing in regards to that. And so they'll use a different strategy. Um, the irony of that, though, is that, you know, Black women also face the discrimination of being called too strong or too assertive or too loud. So they'll get gender policed in regards and from the dominant group from other groups for being strong or assertive or what other people call loud, right? But if they are too girly or feminine, they'll get gender policed from their own community for performing whiteness. um, and so you kind of see a little bit of a difference there between how um, Black women and specifically Asian women are allowed to perform gender because we not only allow in our culture socially acceptable, acceptance of performing that girly girl strategy for Asian women, we almost expect it. Think about that hyper, um, high pitched voice you hear from a lot of Asian women, the cutesy childification type of clothing so that they look like a little girl. They're performing gender and their sexuality by performing the little girl strategy. They may wear bows in their hair. They use a lot of pastels. They'll use a lot of like really cutesy clothing, right? So you see that often. And one of the issues for Asian women, especially if that's not who they want to be or their personality type, is that is often imposed on them by the dominant group, specifically by white men who do tend to hypersexualize Asian women. Not only are they hypersexualized, but they're expected to be shy and deferential and passive and pliable and the Asian ornament, right? The stereotype of the Asian ornament. Um, and that kind of bleeds over to Asian men, where in large part in Western cultures, Asian men are depicted as less masculine, less sexually hyper, hypersexual, not, almost sexually deficient, that it's almost perceived as though they're pliable, they're deferential, they're passive, and that's seen as a threat to their masculinity or somehow not as masculine, as opposed to the way it's seen as a positive by the dominant group onto when it's applied onto Asian women, as it's acceptable and positive for Asian women to be passive and pliable. Um, and if you think that, white men and women get to escape all of that because they happen to be part of that dominant group, that's not true either. One of the things that that middle class women and men who happen to be white face when they're performing gender strategies that people think are appropriate, suitable, or whatever, is that then you become plain, you become boring, you become regular, you become kind of invisible. And so you see this sometimes when you go, I don't know if you've ever visited somewhere and you notice that there's a lot of like young people who have like lots of piercings and color hair and all this stuff, and it's kind of that it actually is a reaction to that being kind of plain or boring or regular, but they're performing their gender in a way that they're trying to push against that, to say I'm not plain, I'm not just regular, I'm not invisible. I want to perform my gender, my identity in a way that's seen. So nobody gets to escape all of it. So I don't think this is in the new edition of the book, um, but previously she had talked about Lisa Wade had talked about wonderful wife strategy and the supermom strategy. And so a wonderful wife strategy is a strategy women who are married to men who have a lot of money or high paying jobs, but also lack the opportunity for career success and advancement themselves, are more likely to adopt the strategy of a wonderful wife strategy, meaning you are going to be very probably thin, you're going to wear really nice clothes, you're going to look really pretty. You're going to have a beautiful house. You are going to do or usually pay for the domestic duties to be done. So you have a beautiful, clean house. That doesn't necessarily mean you do it yourself. You're probably what's considered a homemaker, although you don't have to do a lot of the actual homemaking. You have dinner on the table. You don't actually have to cook it, right? That's the wonderful wife strategy. You're very pretty. You go to the gym all the time. You drive a nice car. You have a beautiful house. You are a stay-at-home mom. Those kinds of things. So women who have access to men who have a lot of access to economic resources are very likely to are the most likely, not very likely, they're the most likely of the different groups to employ the wonderful wife strategy. So this does happen to be usually wealthy white women. Not always, but you'll see, especially among people who are wealthy, this is a strategy that's often used. And people will even say, "Oh my God, she's such a good mom. Like she takes her kids to gymnastics, and she always looks great, and she, dresses really nice, and all of these things. She's such a good mom and wife. She's always there when her husband comes home, right? But she has access to resources that other women don't have, um, and she doesn't have to do a lot of the labor that other women do. Counter that a little bit by a supermom strategy. A supermom strategy is somebody who's trying to be that kind of, but they also work full time. So they're full time jobs. They have a full time job, probably a pretty decent career, and they're full time moms. They might be supporting their husbands. They might be single moms. They might be part of a dual income family, but they're still doing all of the domestic labor. So they go to work full time, they make their kids lunches, they take care of their kids, they take them out to their gym, meeting gym practices. They're taxiing their kids back and forth. They're going to the school meetings that they're supposed to go to, right? They're doing all of that while holding down a job. That's a super mom strategy. Um, it can be done by men. It's what's called a super dad strategy, where you have a female breadwinner and a dad who does all of that, but that's much less common than the supermom strategy. Usually, supermoms are full-time workers. Often um, they are single moms, or they're supporting another spouse who is helping them, or supposed to be helping them, but they're doing the majority of the domestic labor and economic labor. Okay, few definitions. So we need to know the difference between homophobia and heterosexism, heteronormativity, um, and something else. Heteronormative. There was another one. Oh, compulsory heterosexuality, right? Okay, so you guys know what a sexual minority is, right? It's anybody in the LGBTQ community, right? It's anybody who's not heterosexual, essentially, who's cisgendered heterosexual. That's generally everybody else who's not that is a sexual minority. The difference between homophobia and heterosexism. So homophobia is like the fear or hatred, right? And it's kind of like almost an outdated term Because most of the time, what we encounter isn't so much homophobia, it's heterosexism. And heterosexism is a bias against sexual minorities. So you might not fear sexual minorities. You might not even hate sexual minorities. But you as an individual, or more often, and what's more problematic, is an institution has a bias. So you have one set of rules or access to resources for heterosexual people, and lack of access to those same resources, or a different and unequal set of rules for people who are sexual minorities. That's heterosexism. And that's actually what we often face when we're facing some type of discrimination, right? Is heterosexism. And I personally would argue that the institutional bias and discrimination is more impactful. It has more of a detrimental impact on people than the individual one. It sucks if somebody individually does it. But it can really destroy someone's life if it's done through the legal system, or it's done, where you have laws that are completely different, or in the healthcare system, or in education, or in lack of access to the economy. You can't get a job, right? That can be hugely detrimental to people. Um, Although, if lots of individuals have that bias, they're going to create that institutional bias. It's going to create a huge impact as well. Okay, so what's the difference between compulsory heterosexuality and heteronormativity? These are fairly similar concepts, and so that's why I want you to know the difference. Compulsory heterosexuality is a presumptive gender rule. It's the idea that men are attracted to women and women are attracted to men. It's it's why you come out as gay but not as straight. When our babies are born, we assume they're straight and then they come out as gay, right? That's compulsory heterosexuality. Whereas heteronormativity is the assumption of heterosexuality through institutions across the board. So laws are created, institutional rules and policies and systems are applied with heteronormativity as the default, the assumption that in society, um, we're just going to see people who are heterosexual, and that's the norm, and the other one is the exception to the rule, right? So that's heteronormativity. It's a societal assumption. So she then talks about immigration. And the reason why immigration is important is because as it's connected to our social class, our access to resources, people often change their strategies um, for doing gender, and for how they even configure like their lifestyle, their relationships with their spouses and their kids often change based on where you live. So when people immigrate, what can occur quite often is they come from a country where they might be fairly financially secure. Sorry. And and in their country of origin, they were performing the breadwinner, homemaker, um, gender roles in their marriage. For example, if you were in a marriage or a relationship. But when they move to another country, a lot of people experience downward mobility. Downward mobility is a term that means it's a downward economic slide, right? So your socioeconomic position goes down. You make less money, you don't have access to the same types of jobs, you don't have the same prestige in the new country as you did in the previous country. That's downward mobility. And because of that, you see a shift in the strategy, in the gender strategy. And so now you often need, from immigrant couples, often need to abandon that breadwinner homemaker strategy and they need to practice more economic interdependence. What does that mean? They need to both work. And so they're both economically interdependent on each other. Neither one can survive without the other. That's economic interdependence. So you see that occur quite often with people who immigrate. It's, it is one of the things that can occur and does occur. And that related to social class is connected because our social class is a combination. It's not just how much money you make. It's a combination of how much money you make and your social status, right? And because if you experience downward mobility, what you experience is a limited options for performing the gender strategies that you had access to before. So people of higher social class, they actually have a larger variety of options for performing gender than people of lower class, right? Even think about the way that we say things like, oh, that person's classy, she's classy, he's classy, right? When we say classy, we're not necessarily saying it's connected to money in a very real way in our minds. But we're talking about how people carry themselves, how they carry their wealth, how they perform wealth. And you know this is the case. You've seen it, right? I mean, you've seen people who walk with their nose literally up in the air, right? Or they'll walk around. Some people who are wealthy will walk around with an actual look of disgust on their face, like they're disgusted by all the plebeians that are around them, right? All the peasants that are around them, right? They're literally carrying themselves in a way that they're trying to show their wealth, not just with the clothes they wear, which they do, right? The clothes you wear and the purse you carry and the way you do your hair and the way you move your hands and the way you talk. It's like what you wear, what you talk, how you eat, where you eat, the music you listen to, the vacations you take. All of that is a way of signifying class, including the way you perform gender. And the wealthier you are, the more options you have for performing gender. You have different strategies that are available to you. You can do more of the strategies. Um, and she uses an example. She talks about blue collar workers and masculinity. And you've all heard like somebody say, oh, well, real men do real work. And what do people mean when they say real work? They actually mean physical labor. It's kind of interesting because so my husband, he works in construction adjacent. So he does like the intellectual labor side of construction. He's an inspector, called an IOR. He's an inspector of record for hospitals. So when they build a hospital, you have somebody who's actually building the hospital, and then you have my husband who ensures that they follow the code so the hospital doesn't fall down. He's super strict, by the way. If you think I'm strict, my husband's really strict. Um, he's the person who ensures that they follow the code and they build it right. So when Target falls down and you get injured, you can still go to the hospital because the hospital is built right, right? Um, and so a lot of the guys at his work, they'll do the work, but they fail to read the instructions. They won't read the blueprints. They won't read the code. They will often, if they have to do a change order or something like that, they have to do paperwork. They just skip the paperwork and they're like, oh, well, I can do that later. My husband's always getting frustrated because he's like, you can't, right? The implication and the perspective is that physical labor is the real work. By the way, he's done lots of physical labor in his life too. He's pretty old, so he's kind of moved up the ladder, and so he doesn't have to do as much now. But the implication is physical labor is real work, and intellectual labor, working on a computer, reading, writing, doing all those things, that's not real work, right? So the paperwork's not real. And so you do see this from blue collar workers, especially like people in construction, where it's like part of their masculine identity that they do real work, like work with their hands, right? I have rough hands and therefore I'm a real man. Whereas people of a higher socioeconomic status, those men are more likely to equate their income and how many hours they work with their masculinity. So I'm a real man because I make lots of money and I can support my wife and she can stay home. Um, and so you see the identifications of masculinity performed in different ways. Um, but the men who have money have more options available to them for performing masculinity. That's even the case, and especially the case with people who have disabilities. So, one of the strategies, so a lot of the times, wealthy white men, if they ever happen to become disabled, or to obtain a disability. So, if you didn't know though, the APA guidelines and ASA guidelines say you're supposed to say not a disabled person, but a person with with a disability, because you are not the disability, you just have a disability. So that's technically the right or correct way to write it if you're writing it in an academic paper. Also, they say that you are not able bodied, you're technically temporarily able bodied because pretty much everybody becomes disabled as they age. Anyways, that's a little side note. Wealthy white men are able to maintain their masculinity as a gender strategy because they're able to pay for things that other men with disabilities are not able to do. So they're able to maintain their independence in a way that a lot of men who end up with disabilities, like say somebody in a wheelchair, if you're wealthy and you end up in a wheelchair, you can pay someone to help you do the things that you can't do. Whereas if you don't have wealth and you end up in a wheelchair, you're often reliant on family and friends, or you just can't do those things, right? And that because independence is so central to our culture's way of identifying masculinity, it can really become it can become a real issue for men if they become disabled, especially if it's in a way that's like severe, like they become paralyzed. So what you might see as a gender strategy, and we do often see from men of color, is those men of color who become disabled, maybe in a wheelchair, might start performing other attributes of hypermasculinity. So Murder Ball is a good example of that. That's guys who play. If you've never looked at Murder Ball, you should Google it now and watch a video after this YouTube video that I'm doing. But you need Murder Ball. It's a hyper violent sport played by people in wheelchairs. It's one way of performing masculinity for people who have disabilities, or they might become hypersexual and start being very sexually promiscuous, or they might become hyper violent and start being very violent. And these are all other strategies that men have to perform masculinity that they might use because their social class and their able-bodiedness have intersected in a way that change their gendered strategies, and so they might adopt a new strategy. For women who end up having a disability, like being in a wheelchair, um, because women's identity is often very intertwined with being sexual or with our bodies, right? What our bodies look like. You might see women hyper conforming to femininity or being hypersexual as well, or saying that they feel like they've lost their sexual identity altogether because society no longer sees them as a sexual being because they now have a disability. Um, this is something that kind of also happens to women as they age. So women have essentially one option. You can be young and pretty and sexy, or invisible, right? So women are actually kind of expected as they age to adopt a strategy of invisibility, meaning don't be too visible, don't try to be too sexual, don't try to be, over the top, um, because we're no longer going to see you because your body, a young woman's body is the only body we can perceive as beautiful or sexual or sexy or pretty. Men, however, have a slightly different option. They can be the young, good looking guy, or they can be the older, handsome man, right? So we've all seen that where men are considered handsome as they get older, and as their wealth increases, they're considered more attractive. But as women's wealth increases as they get older, they can be perceived as less attractive because not only are they older, but being wealthier means you have too much power and therefore you're problematic as opposed to being more attractive, you're less attractive for partners. These are the terms you need to review. Uh, and that's about it. Oh, here's the picture I was telling you about. I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm going to stop now. 50 minutes. Whew. I hope you stayed this long. Bye.